and good evening. It's October 23rd, 2025, and welcome to another edition of Random Connected Thoughts. I was in a Bible study recently, and I heard a phrase again, and it caused me to pause and reflect on what can be my own bias at times. Because the phrase that was brought up is something that, at least in the circles that I'm in, I'm not sure where you've been, I can only speak for myself, but the phrase was, God meets us where we're at. I don't think it's an uncommon term, I think in at least the churchy circles. But it was often said, God meets us where we're at. So tonight, I wanted to work through this a little bit. And at the same time, I think maybe we can ask, okay, so if it applies to us, as we're implying it applies to us, would it also apply to others? And then within that, is it just as individuals? Is it communities? Because I think the question gets deeper as you go, not just where they're at in another town, another country, another continent, but maybe also to consider another place in another time. So welcome tonight as we discuss some random connected thoughts. Does God meet us where we're at? On the Dusty Feet. Our hope with the Dusty Feet is to foster discussion and to help build and support communities. If you are not already connected to a community or just want to share and interact, this community has 4 primary ways to interact. 1. TheDustyFeet.com. That's our primary place to find everything. You are always free to comment. 2. Substack. Link is in the description below. It's designed around the written and spoken text. It's a place to connect to ourselves and others. 3. Facebook at The Dusty Feet. These videos and other videos are also available for comment and discussion. 4. And as always, you're welcome to send an email to bob@thedustyfeet.com. These places, they will be moderated and guidelines will be set to ensure healthy, safe discussion. And as always on The Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God and the interconnection of His creation. Belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. Oh, and of course, before we forget, if you do find these podcasts useful, please click that subscribe button. Those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, it is when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So one of the reasons I began this series with random connected thoughts, I put parentheses around the word connected, it was a way to discuss things when we may not be entirely sure they're applying it correctly, or there's an idea we're trying to work through, we're trying to connect, or whether it fits not only in our lives, but also in the lives of the people that we read about. So at times, I wonder if we look at the people in Scripture and we tell ourselves that they're real people, right? It's not a fictional story, but rather it's an account of real, actual individuals. But we also realize they're not autobiographies. They're not chronological discussions. It's not a history lesson. There's no viral video to attach. These are stories about people and their connection to God, God's connection to them, the interactions with God, the interactions with others, and the lives that unfold as a result of those experiences, those connections with God, those experiences with God and others. And I kind of hope that makes sense, because I didn't want that to sound too odd, but at the same time, I want to think about one a little bit, because that's how I view it. I'm sure others probably might not view it that way, and that's cool. But this is the context that I'm using when I share this particular thing about God meeting us where we're at. Fair? Okay. Because I'm not opposed to the idea, but I did pose it as a question, because I wanted to say, okay, are we really sure? Are we really willing to allow the thing that we take for ourselves to also actually be for others? It's not It's not about imposing our way on others. It's more about understanding that God can and maybe even is meeting them. And that's a story about them in their place, in their time, where, yeah, God is meeting them. And as I thought about that more, I realized that a particular thought, it expanded because I can't look at them in a vacuum. I can't isolate them. Because then I don't try and put my thoughts back on them from today, right? Those people in yesteryear, because I might see something in a certain way today, and then I might want to overlay that understanding back on them in their place, in their time, because they must have seen it the way that I'm seeing it, them seeing it, right? That sounds a little twisted, yeah? So this is where I began to think more about the points that we read in Torah that present us with challenges. I know those parts where it talks about God addressing them. He's meeting them, relating to the topics of sacrifice, slavery, bondservants, marital interactions between one or more wives. And now we revisit this question. God meeting them where they're at. Because I think that does have a practical side. I think that has more than just the thought of this floaty spiritual talk about God meeting us where we're at. I think this is practical. I think this is the nitty-gritty. Because ironically enough, it continues to surprise me, although probably shouldn't truthfully. It's the number of times that you'll read something in Torah along with other stories in Scripture, and then that light bulb goes on. You go, oh, now I understand why they were told to do or not to do that because of that story that we read before, or even one that we'll read later. But you see, it happened in their story. And God might even still, in that, bless them, work with them, interact with them, keep His promises to them, all meeting them in their place, in the mess, with all of His covenant promises in hand. Because when we get to the instructions for that greater group, right, they say that life lesson, right, meeting them in their time, in their space. It says, I, God, right? I don't want that. You've heard that in the stories before, being a regular practice. I don't want it repeated, right? In this kingdom that I'm setting up, I'm going to set it up for you. This is in this land with me, God, right, as king. This is my kingdom come. So then the phrase God meets us where we're at is really picking up a practical context. Where we're at. And you know, that's not in a vacuum, right? It's not like I can always say this from my sitting in my little Pooler, Georgia studio. It's about where we're at and what's going on also in the greater context. I mean, it's a vast, diverse world out there. There's a lot going on. We're not in a vacuum, but neither were they. And within that, God meets us, and He guides us, and He admonishes us, and He does love us in the space where we're at. But in relation to Torah, He's saying, okay, in this place, at this time, in this space, in my land, this is how I want things to be. This is what you're supposed to be doing. So if you're going to do this, then He's meeting them where they're at and how it will be in their time in His kingdom. So I think sometimes we can now get into an uncomfortable space. Now we're willing to say that God meets us where we are. Then we sometimes justify our actions based on the idea that God just meets us where we are, so we can do what we want. And then at the same time, we turn to these scriptures and we read those stories. Because when we come to these stories where God meets them where they are, and they're doing something that we wouldn't. And for multiple reasons, right? The level of emotion, the response to some of these things depends on that very phrase when they say where we are at. And we want God to do that still for us. Still, I think, it's to be fair. We look to judge them from a backwards glance when God's actually meeting them in their space and they're moving to us. Yeah? Because I think the more challenging and cautionary tale might be the very same thing that we're doing in our lives. Because today, it's going to be looked back upon by others in our future with the same scrutiny. And they have the same stories of Scripture in tow. And it's the way that God meets us today. Each individual in our space, or each community in their space. So are we supposed to think that, well, the way God's meeting us today means that those guys in the future, right? That's how he's meeting them. The way God's meeting me, it's the same way he's supposed to have met them in their time. Does that make sense? I know it sounds crazy, but at the same time, are we willing to look at this God meeting us and God meeting them and look in both ways? There's a man I know, Jay. He's our Bible study leader. He's a man I'm going to really enjoy. I appreciate his heart, his scholarly insight, and the time he dedicates to each of the studies he leads. Recently, his wife passed away. And I got a chance to get a peek, a glance, a glimpse of God meeting him in that time. And through that time, and I thought about it, because I think I need to be careful, almost cautionary about how I view God meeting us in our place. Because when I look at Jay, and then I thought about other people in Scripture who had lost their wives. And I honestly paused. I've tried to take the time to think about them and what they might have felt, what they might have been going through, the experience they're having in their time, in their place where God's meeting them. Because so much of Scripture is really, truly about God meeting them. And within that, honestly, I can't imagine a lot of it. I look at it, but the capacity to grasp all of that, that's almost overwhelming to me. Because every time we see God's interaction with his people, we should be seeing the expression of God's character, right? God's fullness and his integrity, his commitment, his love, right? That's the lens through which we should view all the interactions that we have with God and that God has with us. And I'm referring to both the ones that we like and we don't like. Because I think we actually detach things like judgment or the allowance of consequences from God's character. I think we actually don't connect them, right? God's judgment of us, his judgment of humanity, and that we separate that from his character. I don't think that's intentional. I think we might not even be aware of it, but I think maybe we sometimes maybe categorize it a little differently. However, I think if we're connecting God to meeting us where we are, it's going to be the whole package. The fullness of integrity, the fullness of God meeting us where we are. And I think that includes the promises of consequences, the good and the not so good. Because I think a querisome thought that we sometimes overlook is that many of the things that we might call judgment in Scripture, they're actually just promises from God. Because he said, this will happen. That's a promise. If this happens, he'll spell it out. So God meeting us involves his promises, all of his promises, the integrity of those promises, as well as our reliance on those promises. Because I'll be honest, I'll be upfront, I'm not particularly good at keeping promises. I'm not the example of a promise keeper. That's one of my flaws, at least in this regard. But it's something I need to improve, something I need to work on, because it is part of God's character. So in the midst of the practicality of meeting us where we're at, we have, for example, on a broader scale, we'll use this, the children of Israel wandering through the wilderness. Remember, we're talking about the wilderness in the redemption series, covered in a couple series. It's part of that metaphorical thought of where we might be in this process of, the redemption. Yeah. Again, where we are. But it's not a metaphor for these people, right? They're actually going through it. And in that, God is preserving their clothes. God is preserving their sandals. God is preserving the wares that they carry. And at the same time, everyone 20 or above at the time of they turning away from the land at that advice of the spies, they're all going to die before these children that they have can now regroup, rededicate, renew, and then pass into that promised land, God with them, more promises. God meets them where they're at, doubting, complaining, ungrateful, yet he still feeds, protects, he cares for them, meeting them, meeting their needs. And I wonder if in the middle of that, in the middle of their active lives at that time, because we get told about the preservation of those items, and this is a look back on story, right? But this is being told, the story being shared, but when they're in it, do they realize that this miracle is happening? Do they feel that God is actually meeting them where they are? And yet that's not a fair statement, actually, is it? Because our concept of this individual God that we carry around with us is not the story of where they are in their time in these Hebrew scriptures. Because there, it's very much a communal thing, right? So yeah, I guess I am already biased, introducing something that's laid backwards, of which I probably shouldn't. And yet, I think that at our time and our place where we have this particular view, that maybe we might miss this opposite part, God's communal meeting and expectation. I think because maybe we make it so isolated, so individual, so focused on me, maybe we lose sight of that other side, the other connection. God meeting us where we are, individually or corporately, he meets us. Because that's not a doubt to me, at least the way I understand it. It's not everyone's going to see it this way. And I'm totally convinced and I'm aware that that's true. And yet I'm committed to the thought that he does meet us where we're at. To be genuine in this story, from Genesis to Revelation, he always has. I suppose my bottom point line here is this is giving them the grace to have God meet them where they are. And then the lens through which God meets them where they are, and he gives them the instructions. And then we have all too often seen them viewed as ancient, archaic, even irrelevant at times. But these are the guidance and the instructions for his land that he is setting up. This is in his time. The space with those people. This is set up for God's kingdom on earth. So can I be so bold as to say I can't believe God did that, right? Because those are vital for life in their time. Would I dare say what a waste? Towards the end of Deuteronomy, it spells out the promises and reminds them of the encouragement to pursue them, to make it part of their lives. It's not out of reach. And those promises, well, they're two-way. So I think we might be tempted to disconnect his words from him. I think it's we that disconnect. Because God meets us where we are with the exact same words we have, those and more, right? Because we actually now have his son's visit, right? That Messiah event. So that these words, they're part of God being with us. This is his word. This has been his will the whole time. This is the way he wants things to be. This is God with us in the words written, lived out in the stories. And we see them lived out. It's expressing God among us. And what happens, maybe when we push him out. Because I think if we're living in a certain way, it's an expression of God with us, right? We use this phrase about being God's hands and his feet and his eyes and maybe mouths, right? To live as God with us. God meets us where we're at. At the same time, we are called to be God's representatives to people where they are, but embodying his character, right? Guided by his wisdom, exemplifying the example of, his son, the Messiah. But as God's emissaries, are we thinking that we are part of God meeting us where we're at? Because are we help meeting people where they're at? Then maybe that's part of the upside down thought. God meeting us where we are. Are we willing to be a part of that? To open up to it? To look at it as, am I going to do that? How do I do that? Why do I do that? When do I do that? To whom should I do that? And then even then, in the writings of all those wonderful letters that we have after the Gospels, my life, our lives, they're still so different, so disconnected from them. So yeah, I do believe that God meets us where we are. I think under that, perhaps we overlook the commonality of that will as it was lived out over literal millennia, right? Does God's will change? Did the Messiah change God's will? How do we understand God's will? Because I think that might have a significant influence on our perception of God meeting us and how we view that. Maybe how we view change. Because I think we might even, I'm going to use the word here, I'm going to use judge, as in how we view those living their lives as God meets them, literally and metaphorically, our expectations, their expectations, promises given, stories told. Promises given to us, stories told about us. Right? They're being lived. And yet to be lived. Because we see the character of God played out in his promises. We see the consistency of that. So maybe that is the question that we might wish to consider also, that God meets us where we are, just like he met them where they were. Because I think this should bring us great joy, right? But also, I think it should give us awe and fear. I don't want to make that too light. I don't make that too heavy. I just think it gives us something to ponder about. Because my life today, it's very different from the patriarchs in the Old Testament. It's different with the children of Israel in the land. It's different from the Messiah in the Gospels. It's even different from the times of the writers of all those wonderful letters we have after the Gospels, yeah? My life is so different, so disconnected from those thoughts and those times. Because at times I think it feels more like an image to be viewed, right? And I think we miss the opportunity of a landscape to embrace. Still, I'm not sure if we can honestly imagine the depth of that, because I wonder if they could look. They were looking forward, seeing us, right? And would they be thinking the same thing with them, that God is with them? And in that point, they're also hoping that God is with us. So, thanks for with us tonight on another episode of Random Connected Thoughts. God does meet us where we're at, but He always has on the Dusty Feet.